You may be seated. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. One of the challenges of preaching is explicating the scriptures on a particular subject or insight that everyone on some level already knows. Today's homily is one of those times. What I'm going to speak to this evening is something you most likely already know. Of course, it never hurts to be reminded. One of those things that I think helps to be reminded of is that if you are alive, you have a purpose. I do believe that everyone has a purpose in life. This could be your vocation, that is your job or career, certainly, but not necessarily. Your vocation is sometimes not your mission in life. Sometimes the two do coincide. One way to determine this intersection of life mission and vocation, or the lack of intersection between the two, is to discover or recognize your passion. What are you passionate about? Now, if you're like my wife, Anna, your life mission and vocation may dovetail nicely. She knew from a very young age that she wanted to be a teacher. She has mentioned to me here and there throughout the years that she also sees her teaching career as her mission or purpose. My passion is theology and biblical studies, but I have not really made so much as a dime, so to speak, from that passion. And another passion of mine has been my sons. That too doesn't pay much by way of paycheck, though the non-material rewards are eternal in my thinking. But that's all good. I do not parent my boys, nor do I do ministry for the money. If anything is certain, that certainly is. However, by talking about purpose in life this evening, I'm not really meaning purpose in the sense of the perennial question, what is my purpose in life? It's an important question to ask, no doubt. But what I am referring to is living life on purpose, living life with intention. What makes this kind of life worthwhile is that while you're figuring out your why, which, by the way, can change in your life, you can be living out your how. How will you engage life? How will you engage and treat others? How will you, in other words, show up on the stage of life? Will you be a positive or a negative influence in the world? In today's gospel reading, we see those two kinds of people, the positive and the negative. In other words, Jesus and the religious experts. So the first thing I want to point out is, and this would be the first point, is be assertive. In your relationships, be assertive. The first point I'm making this evening in living out your how is the need to be assertive. That word can mean different things to different people. To some, it has the positive connotation of being confident and a go-getter. It might mean being the dominant force or voice in the crowd. To dominate, however, is not the same thing as being domineering. That's the negative connotation of being assertive. To some, being assertive is being a bulldozer in the crowd. It brings up images of meanness and aggression. But aggression is not assertion. Again, I would see assertiveness as living purposefully. In other words, being conscious of yourself and being conscious of those around you, and knowing what you're doing and why you are doing it. We see exactly this in both Jesus and the Pharisee whose house he visited. For those familiar with the biblical story of Jesus, you know that Jesus and the Pharisees don't exactly get along. Well, can you blame them? Jesus was always, and rightly, pointing out the Pharisees' religiosity and hypocrisy. And while the Pharisees were always plotting to destroy Jesus, both his reputation and his physical life. We see the purposefulness of Jesus' action in the story. The first such action is in verse 1. It says, Jesus went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees. This isn't just some casual visit. Jesus knew he was walking into the proverbial lion's den. He knew he was walking into a mixed crowd at best and an oppositional one at worst. Also notice in verse 1 that they, the Pharisees, were watching Jesus carefully. Yes, they were watching his every move and measuring his every word in order to snag or to trip him up. They wanted to snag Jesus in order to disqualify him in the eyes of the people. And they were intentional about it. Before we go on, though, let's look at the Pharisees. The first thing to keep in mind is that Pharisee and Jew are not interchangeable here. Of course, all Pharisees were Jewish, but that's not my point. How much anti-Semitism could the church have avoided if it kept this truth in mind? Even in John's Gospel, which calls out the Jews as Jesus' main opposition, is better understood as the Judeans, which specifically refers to the religious leaders and the religious establishment that opposed Jesus. Indeed, they feared losing their authority over the people, along with their assumed power and prestige. How do we know this? Well, first, Jesus was Jewish. Second, all of Jesus' earliest disciples and followers were Jewish. In fact, as far as the Gospels are concerned, the disagreement between the Jesus movement and the Pharisees, and Sadducees for that matter, was an intra-family squabble. The Pharisees disliked and distrusted the Sadducees, and vice versa. And the Essenes, they're the sect who lived up on the mountains away from Jerusalem and the temple, and they saw all other Jewish sects as worldly and unfaithful to the covenant. The Jesus movement, or the Messianic sect, became the fourth of these three Jewish sects in the first century. The reason why the Pharisees and Sadducees opposed Jesus was precisely his claim to messiahship, his claim to be the Son of God, his inclusion of the marginalized, and eventually the inclusion of the Gentiles without Torah observance into equal covenant status with the Jews. The Sadducees had the added concern that any Messiah talk, which was revolution talk, would bring down the scourge of the Roman Empire upon the nation of Israel. So the Pharisees were just one of these Jewish sects, which was a cross between a political party and a religious faction. The name probably means separatists, and it was applied to a movement which grew out of the Maccabean era, composed of religious leaders and students of the law. And they tried to create a fence or a hedge around the Torah. It was an elaborate system of oral legislation and interpretation to enable the faithful Jew to obey and apply God's commandments in every area of their life. Originally pious reformers, they were generally well respected by the ordinary, less zealous Jews, even if the Pharisees at times criticized such folks for not being sufficiently obedient and zealous for the Torah. Well, remember that the whole nation, well, why were they zealous? Why were the Pharisees zealous for the Torah? Well, because the nation was exiled in Babylon because they disobeyed Torah. The exile was, and still is really, the defining moment in Jewish history. So any smack of not observing or obeying the Torah was seen as unfaithfulness. And that is precisely what the gospel story is about. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? In the story, there is a man who is a victim of dropsy. Dropsy is an old word for edema, which is a condition where the accumulation of fluid in the body leading to swelling. Speaking of being assertive, Jesus, knowing what his rivals were thinking, flat out asks a question. He doesn't skirt the issue. He's not passive aggressive. He forthrightly asks, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Then, without waiting for a reply or for permission, Jesus heals the man and sends him on his way. So we can learn as well to be assertive in the way Jesus was here by following his example in our dealings with others, and to truly value them as fellow human beings with dignity. You can act purposefully, and not only that, but you can act purposefully in spite of your fears and insecurities. You can act purposely in spite of opposition. Let me explain that one real quick. Christians are to be kind. That is true. But Christians are not called to be nice. If by nice, I mean people pleasing. I mean always feeling like an imposition when you're simply sharing your thoughts or desires. There's a fine line between insisting on your rights and standing up for what is right. The former you may be called to defer. The latter, called to defend. Above all things, speak and act honestly in all your dealings. Don't be weaselly, don't be coy, don't be arrogant. And as psychologist Jordan B. Peterson says, tell the truth. Or at least don't lie. The second point is be compassionate. Your goal is to be assertive in your relationships. Nonetheless, you must also always be compassionate. Again, compassionate does not mean nice or sweet. In fact, it technically means to feel with. Sometimes being compassionate can elicit difficult feelings. For instance, you know the classic example of this. Let's say there's a doctor and a patient. It turns out that the patient has a life-threatening disease. What would be the compassionate thing for the doctor to say? Dear patient, the test came back and you're just fine. Or, of course, your test came back and you have a life-threatening disease. Here are your treatment options. Notice how Jesus heals the man with dropsy. The text says that Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. Jesus not only healed the man, but he also shielded him from the potential fallout between Jesus and the religious leaders. My parents argued quite often and quite loudly, usually my mom more so, and they said many things to each other that no one should ever say in front of their children. Or take, for example, the correction an employer may give to an employee. An employee who may need correction should never be put down by their employer. But this is especially true when it is in, say, a meeting with the whole work team present. I'm sure you get what I'm saying. In dealing with others, be respectful, be tactful, be compassionate. Often, especially in our day of ever-widening ideological polarization, we just want to be right. This goes for politics and religion. Now, don't get me wrong, there is right and wrong. I do indeed make truth claims, even in our postmodern era where overarching narratives are seen to be power plays. For instance, I do believe that Jesus is the only way to God. Not because I ascribe to the Christian religion per se, but because Jesus said it. And I trust and believe what Jesus says. Nevertheless, St. Paul in Ephesians 4:15 tells us to speak the truth in love. What does that mean? At least this. Instead of proving how right you are, show how loving you are. My mom put it like this: you can catch more bees with honey than with vinegar. This doesn't mean to be disingenuous or manipulative. It means if you're really concerned with the truth, then love and serve others. Orthopraxis, or doing right, is just as important as orthodox believing right. That is, if you want to make a difference in the world. Speaking of being compassionate, it's difficult to be right and to be compassionate. It's not impossible. Look at Jesus. But I wonder sometimes about the way we tend to pull it off or not. So we are so sure of our ideologies, our beliefs, and our positions. We are so sure, in fact, that we sometimes forget about that divine, humane quality called kindness. Often in the heat of debate, we lose sight of this, even though we know that we know better. Take the Pharisees' view of the Sabbath law regarding the rescuing of animals. As Jesus intimates, rescuing an animal from peril on the Sabbath was lawful. Healing, however, was not. Jesus is asking what the difference is between rescuing an animal, or even one's son, from a pit on the Sabbath and rescuing him from the pit of disease. Too often in our religious thinking, we can get caught up in the fine print and pay more attention to the letter of the law than to the spirit in which it was written. Not everyone you meet is in the same place as you. Not everyone understands what may be at stake. So yes, be truthful, always. But also be compassionate, always. And third, be humble. This naturally leads to the third point, right? To be humble. Jesus goes on to tell a parable about a wedding feast. Jesus' teaching, though it addresses a discipleship issue, is really a rebuke to many at the dinner table at the Pharisees' home. At a big ancient meal, seats would probably be, the seats of honor would be around the closest to the host. Couches for a meal were usually set in a U shape, with 2 or 4 guests reclining at each couch. The host would sit at the base of the U, with the most honored guest on his left and his right. Power and prestige resided closest to the host. Jesus notes that there's a danger in pursuing seats of honor. He tells the story of a wedding where someone quickly grabs the high seat of honor, but then a more distinguished person walks in, and the host asks the one who was seated first if he could move down. So humiliated, the presumptuous one must head to the last seat. The description in the text of the move down the social ladder points to the person's shame, as if it hurts every step of the way. How much different is it if the guest takes the last seat at the beginning? Then the host will tell that humble one to move up to a higher seat, honoring him before everyone. Jesus uses the term glory, or doxa in Greek, to characterize the honor that results. In fact, a principle is in view here. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. This theme of eschatological reversal runs throughout the whole Old Testament. Jesus' point is not that we should connive to receive greater honor. Rather, he is saying that honor is not to be seized. It is awarded. Jesus is not against giving honor to those who deserve it, but he is against the use of power and prestige for self-aggrandizement. God honors the humble, and those who are truly humble recognize their desperate need for God, not any right to blessing. If you ever think it's too much to be humble, just remember the humility of God. Recall the words of that ancient Christian hymn recorded in Philippians 2, 5-8. It says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was by nature God, did not count equality with God something to take advantage of, but emptied himself by taking the nature of a servant, being born in the likeness of man. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. If God can humble himself for the sake of others, I'm pretty sure you can too. So don't be the I told you so type of person. That's arrogant and ugly. Do you remember the old Sunday school song, If You're Happy and You Know It? Well, what are you supposed to do? Right? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. So if you are right and you know it, good. Clap your hands even. But don't rub it in someone's face. Remember, not everyone is in your position. Not everyone has your understanding. So in your dealings with others, be assertive. Let others know who you are and what you stand for. But, adding to that, be compassionate. Be humble. Be patient. Be honey. Be honey. And be all these things on purpose. Yes, when it comes to our relationships with each other, there is a more excellent way. I end these words with St. Paul. Not only do these words help us get along in the church, they also just help us get along in life. This is what he says. I will show you a still more excellent way. If I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Now unto God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost be all honor and glory both now and forever.